It's 4:50 in the morning at the Bellagio. The poker room is nearly empty. Cleaning staff stack chairs at the far tables. You're still sitting at one of two tables still running, $5,000 in front of you that was $19,000 4 hours ago. Your eyes are dry. Your back has been screaming for the last 90 minutes, and you stop noticing somewhere around hour 6. The dealer pushes you a king and a 7. You look at your remaining stack. Look at the player across from you, a businessman from Dallas who's been chasing his losses since midnight. The kind of player who can't go home a loser even when going home is exactly what he should do. You raise. He calls instantly. Too fast. Too eager. You already know what's about to happen, and it isn't about the cards in your hand. It's about the fact that you've been here before, more times than you can count, and you still can't make yourself stand up and walk away when you're supposed to. You were 22. Community college, dropped out after one semester that felt like it was preparing you for nothing in particular. A part-time job at a warehouse, loading boxes onto trucks 8 hours a shift, your hands raw, your back already starting the slow complaint that would follow you for the next 2 decades. You had $500 in a checking account and a feeling, vague but persistent, that your life was going nowhere specific and arriving there slowly. A friend sent you a video. A guy who turned a small deposit into $80,000 in a single weekend playing online poker. You watched it once. Then again. Then a dozen more times over the following week, at work, on break, lying in bed at night replaying the moment the guy's screen showed the final number. You opened an account. Deposited $100. Sat down at a $2 table with hands that were already shaking slightly, though you told yourself that was just caffeine. You lost it in 45 minutes. You deposited another $100. Lost that too. You deposited your last $200. Actually your last, the kind of last that meant skipping groceries if it went wrong, and won $80. It wasn't much. But something lit up in your chest that the warehouse had never once made you feel, not in 2 years of loading the same trucks. You cashed out $280. Bought a strategy book. Read it in 2 days. Found a free training series from a well-known pro and watched the entire thing in a week, taking notes like it was the only class that had ever mattered to you. Your mother said she was worried. Your father said you needed a real job. You tried explaining that this wasn't gambling, that you were studying a skill, that you were going to take this seriously. They nodded the way people nod when they've already decided not to believe you. You didn't care. Something had clicked into place that you didn't fully understand yet, and you already knew you weren't going back to the warehouse. You were 24. You'd moved out 6 months earlier into a one-bedroom apartment in the cheap part of town. 2 monitors on a desk in the living room. The desk was the apartment, as far as you were concerned. Everything else was just where you slept and occasionally ate. You played 10 hours a day. 12 on weekends, when the recreational players were drunk enough to be careless with money they could afford to lose. 8 tables running simultaneously, sometimes 10, your brain trained to fold here, call there, bluff the river on table 6 without losing track of the pot odds on table 3. You made $14,000 that year. More than the warehouse. Also less than you'd quietly hoped, somewhere in the part of your mind that still believed in the $80,000 weekend. You learned the word that would define the next decade of your life, variance. The gap between how you should be running based on the math, and how you were actually running based on the cards. Variance meant you could play 40,000 hands with flawless decisions, and still be down money at the end of it. Variance meant you could play badly for a week and somehow come out ahead. It was the cruelest and most necessary idea in the entire game, and you spent more time thinking about it than you spent thinking about almost anything else in your life. You tracked everything. Win rate to the decimal. Hourly rate by stake. A spreadsheet that knew more about your performance than you did. A private database of opponents, who bluffed too often, who never folded a pocket pair, who tilted after one bad beat and could be exploited for the rest of the session. Your girlfriend left after 4 months of watching you disappear into the monitors. She said she couldn't compete with a laptop. You didn't argue, because she wasn't wrong. You ate delivery food every night. Gained 20 pounds. Your eyes burned by the end of every session, and you kept a bottle of drops on the desk that you used a dozen times a day without thinking about it. Your bankroll climbed to $22,000. You were beating every limit you sat at. You talked strategy in private chat rooms with people whose faces you'd never seen and whose screen names you knew better than most people's real ones, the closest thing you had to friendship, for now. You learned to recognize tilt before it could ruin you. The hot feeling in your chest after a bad beat, the urge to raise with nothing just to punish the universe for the unfairness of a river card. You learned to close the tables when it hit. Walk around the apartment. Do push-ups until it passed. The players who couldn't control that feeling didn't survive. You'd seen their angry screenshots on the forums, their bankrolls gone in a week. You promised yourself you wouldn't become one of them. You were 26, with $60,000 in your bankroll, and you decided the online grind, profitable as it was quietly hollowing you out. You drove an hour to a casino. Walked past the slot machines and the blackjack pit, through air that smelled like cigarettes and floor polish and a specific kind of desperation you'd only ever read about before. Sat down at a $2/$5 table. Bought in for $500. Your hands shook the first time you touched the chips. You hadn't felt that in years. Live poker moved at a different speed. 30 hands an hour instead of 600. You folded constantly. The old man to your right was a rock who only played premium cards. The guy in the Hawaiian shirt was drunk, out of state, playing every hand, your target. The kid in the hoodie across the table was clearly a pro like you, not your target. You learned to read more than cards. Whether a hand shook when someone pushed in a big bet, usually strength, not weakness, because nerves came from real hands and calm confidence often hid a bluff. The way people stacked their chips. The way they looked at the board after the flop. Every detail was information. Every piece of information was an edge you could spend. You played 50 hours a week. Lived on coffee and the same mediocre club sandwich from the casino restaurant, because leaving the table when the game was good felt like leaving money on the floor. You were up $18,000 after 3 months. The floor staff started knowing your name. Regulars nodded at you when you walked in. You weren't famous. But you were becoming a fixture, and for the first time in your life, you felt like you belonged somewhere. You were 28, with $140,000 built from 2 years of cash games, and cash games paid the bills, but tournaments were where the actual glory lived, the final tables, the cameras, the chance at a number that could change everything in a single weekend. You started small. $500 buy-ins at regional casinos, then $1,000 at bigger venues. You learned tournament poker was an entirely different animal. Blinds climbing every 30 minutes, no rebuying once the early levels passed, survival and accumulation the only currency that mattered. The variance here was brutal in a way cash games never were. You could play flawlessly for 10 hours and bust 2 tables from the money on a single bad beat. You could run deep through 100 tournaments in a row and never sniff a final table. You made your first one at a $2,000 event in Florida. Finished 5th. Won $34,000. Flew home feeling like you'd arrived. Then 6 months without a single cash. $60,000 of your bankroll gone chasing the next score that never came. You started wondering if you were running bad or if you'd simply gone bad, if the younger players, the ones raised on solvers and game theory software, had quietly passed you by while you weren't looking. You hired a coach. $2,000 for 10 hours with a player who'd made World Series final tables. He took your game apart and showed you leaks you hadn't known existed. Taught you ICM, the way chip value shifts relative to payouts late in a tournament, the way a chip isn't a chip once the math of survival enters the picture. You studied. You improved. You started cashing again. Finished 3rd in a $3,500 Vegas event for $112,000. Somewhere in the swings, the giveth and the taketh, you discovered you loved this in a way you hadn't expected. The 14-hour days. The mental exhaustion at the end of a level when your brain felt like wet cement. The exhale at the money bubble. The nerves before a final table that weren't fear anymore, just anticipation. You lived out of a suitcase. Cheap hotels near every venue. The same airport chain restaurants in city after city. The same faces, again and again, at every stop, regulars and pros you were slowly becoming one of, nodding at you the way you used to only watch them nod at each other. You were 31. Bankroll rebuilt to $400,000. Vegas, full-time now, a small apartment off the strip you barely used because the tourists and the bachelor parties weren't your world. Your world was the local rooms, Bellagio, Aria, The Wynn, where the actual regulars played. You'd moved up to the $10/$25 game. Buy-ins of $5,000 minimum. A single pot could swing $10,000 in a few minutes. At this level you weren't playing tourists anymore. You were playing other pros, wealthy businessmen treating the game like an expensive hobby, and, occasionally, a whale. The whale, this particular run, was a tech executive who'd fallen for poker after watching it on television and genuinely believed he could beat the table. He couldn't. You and the other regulars had an unspoken arrangement, no unnecessary friction with each other, patience for the whale, small wins handed to him so he'd keep coming back. You complimented his good folds. You let him feel like he belonged. He came back for 6 months before he finally stopped. By then he'd lost $400,000 across the table, and he'd tell his friends, like everyone in this world tells their friends, that he'd broken even. Your life had a rhythm now. 6 nights a week at the table. Sleep during the day. Workouts 3 mornings a week before you went to bed at sunrise instead of after it. You nodded at other pros at the gym and rarely spoke. Everyone here had secrets, and everyone respected everyone else's silence about them. You made your first million by 31. You didn't feel rich. You felt like someone with a specific, strange job that happened to pay extremely well. You were 33 when you won a televised side event at a World Poker Tour stop. 2 million people watched the stream. You beat a 3-time champion heads up for $840,000 and a trophy worth less, in the end, than the attention that came with it. A major poker site reached out within the week. Sponsorship, their patch on your shirt at every televised event, a weekly stream on their platform, branded tournaments. $150,000 a year plus expenses plus a cut of referral revenue. You signed without much hesitation. You weren't famous, not at the level of bracelet winners or the high-roller millionaires, but you were recognizable now. People asked for photos in airports. Strangers found you online to relitigate hands from years ago, some of them friendly, some of them still bitter about a bad beat you barely remembered giving them. You had an agent. A manager. A social media presence shaped, increasingly, by people whose actual job was shaping it. A clothing line. A training series with your name on it. Merchandise. The poker still mattered. But it had stopped being the only thing that mattered, and you weren't always sure anymore which version of this life you'd actually signed up for, the game, or the brand the game had turned you into. 250 days a year in hotel rooms. The European Tour, the World Series, the Bahamas. Room service and casino restaurants. Weeks at a time where you genuinely forgot what your own apartment looked like. You were 36 when you decided to take your shot at the games that ran in private rooms, Macau, Los Angeles, London, where the minimum buy-in was $200,000 and a single hand could move more money than most people earned in a decade. You'd never been so frightened and so alive in the same moment. Your first session, $500,000 in front of you, a hedge fund manager from Hong Kong to your left, a Russian businessman whose income nobody at the table could quite describe, a tech billionaire whose face you'd seen on magazine covers, and 2 pros you knew from the circuit. Blinds at $1,000 and $2,000. A standard raise of $8,000. Pots reaching $50,000 before anyone had even seen a flop. You had to recalibrate everything you understood about money. The chips had to stop meaning anything in your head, or you'd never make a correct fold with $80,000 in the pot, never fire a proper bluff for $60,000 without flinching. You won that first session. Up $340,000 when the game broke at 6 in the morning. You walked back to your hotel through a casino gone quiet and empty and felt like you were floating 6 inches off the carpet. Then you lost the next 3 sessions. Down $1.1 million across 10 days. You sat in your hotel room and shook. Called your coach. Called your therapist. Called your parents, your mother asking if you were okay, and you told her you were fine, just tired, and didn't tell her anything close to the truth, because she wouldn't have understood it, and you weren't entirely sure you did either. This level wasn't about skill anymore, not primarily. It was about psychology, about not letting a bad run break something in you that wouldn't put itself back together. About sitting down again the next day with the same focus, even while every part of you was screaming to get up and never come back. You sat down again. Won back $700,000 over the following 3 weeks. Still down overall. Still in the game, which was, at this level, the only thing that actually mattered. You were 39. $6 million in investments. A house in Vegas, an apartment in LA, a car you rarely drove and a watch collection you rarely wore. You'd figured out, slowly and then all at once, that the real money in this game had stopped being at the table. You launched a training site with 3 other pros. Built out a full library, tournament strategy, cash game theory, mental game, bankroll management. $500 a month for premium access. 8,000 subscribers in the first year. $4 million annually from the site alone, run by writers, editors, video producers, developers, a company, not a hobby. A podcast followed. Interviews with other pros, with poker writers, with people entirely outside the game whose work applied anyway, decision scientists, behavioral economists, athletes. Hundreds of thousands of downloads an episode. Then a staking business, identifying young, talented, broke players, fronting their tournament buy-ins, taking half of whatever they won. 20 players in your stable at any given time. Some of them were the best investments you'd ever made. Some never cashed at all. The portfolio worked out across the whole, the way it's supposed to. You'd become, without quite planning it, a venture capitalist, a media executive, a coach, a content creator, a manager of other people's careers. You still played, but rarely out of necessity now, charity events for the attention, invitation-only high rollers when you felt like it. The game had stopped being your livelihood. It had become your hobby. Your brand. The story you told about yourself in 100 different podcast interviews, slightly different each time depending on who was asking. You were 47 when you were inducted into the Poker Hall of Fame, one of the youngest people to ever receive it. The ceremony ran during the World Series. Your parents flew out. Your mother cried. Your father shook your hand and told you, in front of everyone, that he was proud of you, the first time in 47 years he'd said those exact words out loud. You tried very hard not to cry in front of him. You're still not sure you succeeded. You'd become a statesman of the game. Consulted on new formats. Named on witness lists when regulators considered online poker legislation. Boards. Advisory roles. Conference talks on the intersection of probability and decision-making that had nothing, technically, to do with cards anymore. You'd written a book. 300,000 copies sold, a documentary in development. You still played, mostly for the feeling of it now, a few of the marquee events every summer, a cash session at the Bellagio just to remember what your hands used to know without thinking. Younger players called you sir. Some had learned the game watching you on television as kids. Some had learned it from your own training site. They were intimidated by you in a way that made you uncomfortable, because in your own head you were still just a kid who'd gotten obsessed with the card game at 22 and never managed to stop. You didn't tell them that. You smiled. You folded. You bluffed. You took their money sometimes, and sometimes they took yours, and the game kept moving the way it always had. You were richer than you'd ever imagined being at 22 loading boxes in a warehouse. You were also more alone than you'd expected. No marriage. No kids. The game had always been there instead, patient and constant, calling you back every time you drifted near the idea of another kind of life. You'd made a choice a long time ago without realizing, at the time, that it was a choice at all. You're 64 now. Your name gets said with a kind of reverence by players who weren't born when you won your first title. Documentaries exist about you. Books exist about you. You agreed to a few of them. Most you didn't. You've survived the game-changing shape around you 3 separate times. You have more money than you'll ever need and you've given most of the excess away. Scholarships at your old high school, a wing at the children's hospital in the city where you grew up, a foundation with your name on the letterhead. You live quietly. Coffee on the patio at sunrise. History books and biographies stacked by the chair. Your hands ache on cold mornings now, decades of shuffling chips finally collecting their toll. Your eyes aren't what they were. You still play, a weekly private game with 6 other old pros, the last of a generation that's getting smaller every year. Last month, one of them died. A heart attack at 71. You flew to the funeral. Saw men you hadn't seen in decades. Told stories about hands from tournaments in the 90s that nobody else alive would remember accurately. At the graveside you felt the full weight of it for the first time in years. All the hands, all the money won and lost and won again, all the relationships made and quietly broken around a table covered in green felt. You wonder sometimes what your legacy actually amounts to. Whether the game will remember you in any way that matters once the people who watched you play are gone too. You suspect it won't. Not really. Not for long. You made peace with that a long time ago. Somewhere right now, a 22-year-old is sitting in his parents' house. He's watched a video of a stranger winning $80,000 in a single weekend. He can't stop thinking about it. He's about to deposit $100 on a site he's never used before. He has no idea what he's about to sign up for. The sleepless years. The broken relationships. The thousands of hands of study. The variance that will nearly destroy him before it lifts him higher than he ever imagined. He'll walk the same road. Make the same mistakes. Learn the same lessons, the hard way, the only way they're ever actually learned. Maybe he makes it all the way to the top. Probably he doesn't. He'll try anyway. They always try. The cycle continues.